this is a session that I do get quite a few queries from teachers as well about catering and how do we better cater to some of our more gifted students. So I've got the expert here in the Victorian Association of Gifted and Talented. So we're hoping to work much closer with them in this sort of area. So our presenter tonight is Simone, and Simone's currently completing her PhD specifically in this area and fostering mathematical promise of high potential mathematics students. Her focus is on the provision in classrooms, co-curricular school offerings and outside of school as well. Simone is a graduate of Maths and holds an M.Ed in Gifted Ed. She's worked for the corporate world for over a decade, has spent 4 years as a maths mentor in a school in Metro Melbourne, and she's currently teaching maths and numeracy units to pre-service students at Monash Uni Faculty of Ed. So I welcome Simone, and I'm sure we'll be quite informed by what she has to present today. Just a couple of other housekeeping. For this session, I've asked the Department of Ed to record the session. So all of you who are participating, you will get a link to the recording. Secondly, just a couple of protocols, because we do have quite a few people. We've got a few school settings. I think we've got a primary out at Horsham, we've got Benalla FCJ over there, and then we've got individuals. So I've asked Simone that every 15 minutes or so, I'll ask you throughout the presentation to please keep your mics on mute, otherwise we'll be able to hear everything you're saying, and it does cause a bit of a disturbance. So when we come to question, every 15 minutes or so, I'll stop and ask for questions. At that stage, when you have a question, you unmute your particular mic so that we can hear you, and then we'll continue from there. Okay, thank you. Over to Simone.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to see interest in this area. I've spent a few years researching it now towards the end of my PhD, so just because I'm passionate in it doesn't mean that everyone is. So thank you also to Mathematical Association of Victoria. We're really pleased to be developing these partnerships so that we can spread what the research says and what different practices around different schools are to let people know what's being done. Will people be able to see the mouse if I point? Great. Okay, then I will launch in. In this webinar, what I basically want to cover is what the definition of mathematical promise is, and we'll talk about some of the different terminology that's used. I'll talk about some of the different models of talent development. I'm only choosing a few because I want to focus more on practice than on sort of theory. But the really important elements is deciding what your goals are. So what are our goals, I guess, as a country, as a state, and then as a school and as individual teachers. We'll talk about identification and then strategies and implementation. So first of all, there's actually no single...
I think there might be someone who's got their mic not muted, because we've got a bit of background noise. So can you please ensure you've got your mics on mute, unless it's just the car. It sounds like... It's traffic noise, but anyway. Okay.
Should I keep going? Okay. So essentially there's not actually any single agreed definition of giftedness, and that's a term that I probably won't use that much through. I prefer the terminology of high potential. I think it's clearer to people because the plain English meaning is the same as the kind of the academic meaning. But basically around Australia, particularly in Victoria, most people use what's called Gagne's differentiated model of giftedness and talent. So what I'd like to do is just briefly show you that. Because this is used so widely around Australia, it's worthwhile understanding what it shows us. And what it basically, the model says is that we've got these natural abilities, which people will often refer to as gifts or high potential. And then there's this talent development process, which then leads to competencies or talents, or high performance. And the way Gagne's defined it, but there's quite a bit of debate about whether it's the top 10%, top 1 to 2%, top 20% if you're going to go with sort of Renzulli's school-wide enrichment model. And then there's the definition that says, well, actually, and that was John Geek, who unfortunately is no longer with us, he said, we actually just shouldn't worry about percentages. What we should do is provide a program for students who just need something different. So it's, in other words, it can be as flexible as we want it to be. But the key here in terms of what I'm focusing on today is what are these development processes? What can we actually do to help these students develop their potential into talent? And there's another model that I actually want to talk about. This one is from Lania Konevsky over in Canada. And what she does is focus on this learning potential, which is in the centre. And I point that out because the general knowledge base, we have to accept that when children come into school, they come in with already very different mathematical bases of knowledge. When children move through school and potentially change to a new school for secondary school, they'll come from different schools and so have a different wide range of their actual knowledge base. So what we might expect as their prior knowledge may not actually match what they come with. But what we're talking about when we're talking about children with high intellectual potential is their information processing is incredibly efficient. So what you might be seeing is very fast processing in terms of acquiring new knowledge, understanding what you're doing, being able to generalise. And I will go into that in more detail.
Can we ask you to please not, on your apps, Polycom does allow you the flexibility of changing the screen. So if you were going to share something with us, so I think someone's changed the settings. So we'll just
change it.
Yeah, I'll just change it back.
Okay.
So if you please avoid changing the settings because it allows that flexibility of people sharing.
Okay, great. So I point this out because I know that I've worked with students who've come from overseas and their curriculums might be quite different from us, or even students, as I said, moving from different schools. So I remember speaking to one head of maths from a regional area in Victoria who said she could basically pick which primary school a student came from based on their knowledge of fractions, unsurprisingly. So bearing in mind that we can't just sort of work out what do students already know and assume that they're high potential because we don't know actually what their prior experiences were and how that's impacted their knowledge base in mathematics. And then obviously students might have developed their own sense of metacognition and thinking about their own thinking, but they can also be guided in developing that, and that has an impact on how they learn. So what I use, the terminology I use, which was developed in America 20 years ago now, is called mathematical promise. And it actually is a wider definition, which is more inclusive, particularly of minorities and people from diverse backgrounds, because it includes not just ability, which is what Gagne's model is, but also motivation, belief, and experience or opportunity. So if you think about it, it looks at what's happening inside the student, the ability, in terms of their cognitive ability. It looks at their psychosocial, so their motivation and belief. So I would never, in terms of a student being mathematically promising, if a student's really, really keen on maths, I wouldn't want to say you can't do any of these extra activities. We just have to make sure that the match between what they're capable of and the activity are not going to also scare them away. And then experience or opportunity, and that's the social side. That's what we provide for students. So in actual fact, the promise resident in any particular individual is also a function of what the environment around them provides, whether it's family, whether it's school, those types of opportunities. And they can be provided opportunities. That doesn't mean they're going to take them up and make the most of them, but that then feeds into what their experiences are. So I've talked about the sort of definitions about what high potential is and what mathematical promise is. I want to talk a bit more about goals, because unless we're clear about what we're trying to achieve, we can't actually make decisions about what we're going to deliver. So if you go to the Melbourne Declaration, this has been around for a while, so people are probably fairly familiar with it. It's now 2008. One of the first goals talked about promoting a culture of excellence in all schools, and I'll point out the words at the bottom, particularly enabling all students to explore and build on their gifts and talent. So the assumption is that right across Australia, we are doing that in an educational sense. The second goal is that we're actually helping students become successful learners who are motivated to reach their full potential. So that was the heads, the ministers for education right around Australia for a decade ago. More recently, the Department of Education in Victoria put out a vision for aiming high, which also then specifically talked not just about all students and the goals, but about what we should be doing for gifted and talented students. And the terms gifted and talented are used in various ways. I won't go into that now. I could probably spend an hour on that alone. So I'm going to stick with what Gagne's definition is, difference between high potential and high performance. But what essentially the aiming high vision said was that we should provide differentiated learning experiences, which may be acceleration, may be extension, but the key is that we want the students to be challenged. But we also need to recognise they need support for their social and emotional development. So these are sort of very nice general statements about education and about gifted students. I want to drill more a little bit into what our goals could be, should be, for actually mathematics education. So this was a continuum of mathematical capability that was put forward by Linda Sheffield, again, almost 20 years ago, starting with enumerators. Enumerators being people who didn't actually really know any maths at all. Doers would be people who have a basic ability to do sort of very early level primary sort of mathematics. Computers are people who are, and we're talking about starting to move into what our education system is trying to achieve. Computers are people who can do the computations, and consumers are those who can also take in information and manipulate it. But what we're trying to achieve in terms of building all our students, but particularly those with high potential, is moving into problem solving, and that's coming more and more into what we're actually doing in the classroom, a lot more worded problems, but problems that students don't necessarily, so more open-ended, problems that students don't actually know how to solve them yet. So they're not exercises that have words sort of pushed around them, but actual things that they haven't been shown an example, they actually have the opportunity to think. And the next step up is actually encouraging students to pose their own problems, to not stop at what we've given them as educators, but to actually start to encourage them to say, what if? What if this, what if that? And I'll go into this in a little more detail when I talk about strategies. But the idea with problem poses is we're actually then giving it the opportunity back to the students to explore and to play with maths. And it's moving much more into the domain of what people who regard themselves as professional mathematicians actually do. They're constantly asking questions and then testing what happens and playing with the mathematics. And then at the higher level is actually people who are actually creating new mathematics. The reality is many mathematicians and many people who use a lot of mathematics in their everyday life don't necessarily get to that creators level, and that's perfectly fine because they're all making very valuable contributions to the community. So what does that look like in terms of words? The goals for promising mathematics students should be that we're helping develop an informed citizenry. So along that trajectory, we're trying to encourage all young people to develop higher levels of mathematics so that they can become really engaged. And particularly in this day and age where we've got lots of facts and information, statistics and politics and messaging thrown at us through marketing, being able to be critical about their thinking becomes important. Helping them become deep mathematical thinkers is very much about what we want for students, and allowing students to experience the joy and beauty of mathematics. For many students, it might be enabling them to actually enter university and beyond and engage with mathematics. Some students might decide not to become mathematicians. I've had students who've performed in outstanding levels both in their VCE and also in competitions who've chosen to become doctors or a range of other things. But the point is we've opened up the opportunities for them because mathematics is a gateway subject, and if you don't do it, particularly at the higher levels, it can shut off. If you haven't done 11 and 12, it can shut off options. And also in the sense of the mathematics, what we're trying to do is help to develop world leaders. Our world is becoming increasingly technological, and so having the ability to problem solve and to reason becomes really important to make sense of that. Now, what I want to take you through next is a hierarchy of mathematical talent, which was put forward by an academic called Oziskin. And he talked about, and I will refer to my notes here so I get the definitions right, but there are being different levels. So this isn't about all students, but particularly about the students who have high potential. And he said that that 0 level is no talent, which is basically adults who have very little mathematics. Level 1, basic talent culture level, is just the rudimentary number sense. So the sort of maths that we'll learn up to about Year 6 curriculum. And essentially that's the job of primary school teachers to teach to level 1. Level 2, the honours student, is the knowledge of algebra and algebraic reasoning. So these sort of students can actually major in mathematics, and many of them may, or some of them may become secondary maths teachers. So it's the job of secondary maths teachers to get students up to that level of talent of level 2. And I've got them colour-coded because I'm going to come back to this later when I talk about strategies and opportunities. But beyond that, he defined the terrific student. So it's a student who needs to work on problems beyond classwork and the curriculum, and he referred to it being the top 1 to 2% of students. So they're capable of becoming mathematics majors and actually pursuing graduate studies in mathematics. So just because there's this hierarchy of mathematical talent doesn't mean that everyone actually wants to reach a particular level. That's going to be guided by what their interests and motivations are. But the important thing here for level 3 is that opportunities can be provided by co-curricular activities and extracurricular activities like maths clubs and maths teams. Level 4 is the exceptional student, so excelling in mathematics competitions, potentially receiving admission into mathematics summer camps and academies. This is particularly evident here from America overseas, where they'll have mathematics summer schools that last for weeks or months, and it's the top 0.5%. So students who are operating at level 4 are typically on their own because they want to, devoting hundreds of extra hours to mathematics a year, and they're already acting like a mathematics major while they're in high school. So you started to see different personality characteristics also having an influence on what level a student might wish to achieve or might achieve with encouragement and a nurturing environment. Level 5 is the productive mathematician. It's someone who's got a PhD and they're capable of publishing in the field. Doesn't mean they're going to revolutionise it. Exceptional mathematicians are those who move the domain forward, and the all-time greats are those who are the giants. So basically the field medal winner. And the reality is we can't all get fields medals. We may not even want to. It takes a lot of time and a lot of creativity. But the point is that thinking about the different levels and understanding what we need to do to actually help students, particularly from moving from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and for our high potential students moving from 2 to 3 and even 3 to 4, become, from an education point of view, our responsibility. Not all parents are able to provide that type of environment or support for their students. So they're really looking at the professional educators to come up with ideas, guidance, resources and those types of things. So next step after this, I wanted to talk about what those characteristics may be, and this is really the first step in a sense of identification. So Krotetsky, who was a Russian psychologist, did, and it's a really lovely qualitative study, I've got a photo of the book at the end, but he identified what he said were the characteristics. So ability to formalise, ability to generalise, ability to operate, so numbers and symbols, their reasoning, ability to skip steps, to go backwards and forwards, so a bit of a flexibility of the mental process, thinking flexibly, being able to use mathematical memory, which is something that's a bit contested. People are now saying that actually computation and memory are not critical elements. They're obviously very helpful, but not critical elements for actually being high potential mathematics. And ability to work with spatial concepts. It can be for students who want to head into areas of mathematics that are very, dependent on visual spatial strength, but not necessarily for all mathematics.
I might just stop there. I'm just going to stop there for a moment because I just want to check that everyone else is not in the same situation. I've just had a text from someone saying that they can only see the screen with us in it and they can't see the PowerPoint. So could I get a hands up if you could see the PowerPoint at the moment? Thumbs up? Yep. Okay, so everyone else can see the PowerPoint. Nathan, I don't know whether you had altered your content screen at all? Okay, because we've got the content sharing if everyone else can see it. I think it might just be, I don't know if you've changed your settings at all.
I wonder when it happened before, whether it's happened to everyone.
Yeah, whether it happened before, it's only just the one. All right, so maybe it's okay to stop for questions.
I'll just finish this one slide and then we'll stop. Okay. So essentially what Ziskin did is says actually we can summarise all of what Krotetsky said into actually 4 steps. Students' ability to actually formalise it, which might be, the generalisation, to actually see the situation of what's happening, their logical thought processes, their ability to skip steps, which I know once we get to the senior end of school, we're trying to encourage them to write down more steps because they need to communicate their thinking as opposed to just doing it, and then flexibility to try different strategies and different options. So this is a good point to stop for questions.
Okay, so we might just go around. If you have a question, please go ahead. We'll actually unmute your mic at this stage and we'll know that if you've got a question. So any questions, anybody? Horsham, all good? Okay.
It's a water break.
Vanilla, you're right? No questions? Okay, good. Okay, so Nathan, you can obviously hear us. It's just you can't see the PowerPoint at the moment. All right.
The recording will be useful.
Yeah, you will get a recording. Unfortunately, I'm sorry at this stage we can't do much more about that one. So you'll get the recording, and everyone will get access to PowerPoint as well. So.
Okay, so the next thing I want to talk to you was about identification. So for us to summarise that, what we're typically looking for is mathematical reasoning, In areas like geometry, it can be really useful for students to actually have strong spatial reasoning, and that comes up quite a bit in numeracy, particularly when I'm working with pre-service teachers, that not all of them actually can sense what's happening spatially and convert that into what's happening symbolically. Also might want to be looking at the school mathematics performance, but again, as Garnier said, we're talking about potential and performance. That doesn't mean that everyone with high potential will actually perform at a high level. And one of our top mathematics students a few years ago, who won several gold medals and got his lovely scholarship to go to an English university, his ATAR wasn't a 99.95. He still performed exceptionally well, but I think we need to be really careful to not demand of students that they're getting 100% in everything, because they may have clumsy work habits, before we actually provide for them. We're looking at problem-solving performance, and I know that there have been students that I've worked with who have been phenomenal at problem-solving in competitions, but not necessarily so great at their classroom maths. So looking at multiple sources can be useful, and also any examples of creativity. So when I've done group work, I typically know who's going to come up with really out-of-the-box solutions, and I'll let different students actually share them, so that they can see a range of different ways that someone solved a problem. So doing with our Year 8 students the Year 11 and 12 Australian Maths competition, so they hadn't actually seen the problems before, we did them just live in class, was actually a really interesting opportunity to really stretch those students and see if they could come up with nice ways to transform the problem. So there are different approaches, and I'm going to just sort of here refer to a list. But essentially there are, I've put in quotes, objective assessments, because sometimes people question whether they are, but some things that you can use to look for mathematical ability would be the school mathematics test. What's happening in class? Are they doing well, or at least are they showing consistently strong performance even if they're not getting 100%? Because someone who has a real eye for detail and who might be what we'd call a high achiever might actually perform consistently better than a student who has high potential but is a bit slapdash. There are other things like standardised testing, such as the psychometric tests or the what used to be called the IQ tests, and there are sub-tests, for instance, in the WISC that can be really good at identifying specifically mathematical potential, and then achievement tests, so looking at what's the difference between the potential and the performance. I'm going to talk a bit more about dynamic testing, but it's something that I haven't seen done very often, and it's a great way to look at honing in on that centre on the learning potential. And then mathematical creativity. Multiple solution tasks, so encourage students to see how many different ways they can solve something. I'm going to talk a bit more about that as well. And then on the subjective side, obviously the most traditional form or method for identifying students with high potential is actually teacher nomination. And teachers might be relying on class tests and conversations. Some things to also consider are there are behavioural rating scales. I'll take you through one of those. Observations of students' problem solving. So if you're getting them up to the board and they're having a live conversation, so getting them to explain to you or to other students what their thinking is, so that you can see the steps that are going on and also the leaps that they're making. And also analysis of written work. So it's not just about solving the problem, but perhaps thinking and reflecting, and this is really helpful for metacognition, about why they chose to do things in certain ways and whether they took one path and then did another path. Parent nomination is actually just generally in gifted education been found to be quite accurate in terms of testing. Even those, the majority of parents who said, I think my child is gifted, tended to be correct, and if not, their students might have fallen into category which they were really, really high, but just under the level that would typically have been in the past associated with psychometric testing, which is the top 2%. So if parents are telling you that their children are a bit bored in class, or they thirst for more, they're loving what you're doing but they want more, that's something to take into account as you're considering the big picture. If you offer electives or subjects that students can self-nominate into, that can be really insightful. And in certain year levels, once students become a bit shyer about putting themselves forward, you can walk around and have one-on-one chats with people and say, well, who would you go to for help? So peer nomination. Because the kids themselves, the students, they know who's really good. They know who's good at making those creative leaps. They know who's really good at explaining. They know who's good at seeing all the different strategies. They're really insightful. But what comes out of the research is definitely not to just rely on one measure, but to use a range, and to not just do it at one point in time, but to keep on checking in so that you're watching progress and you're getting feedback from students. So talk a bit more about dynamic testing. It's actually focusing on, rather than what they know now, but their capacity to learn. So the idea is pre-test the students on something, then provide instructions on their needs to actually take them further in whatever that topic is, and then retest to assess. So you're actually seeing how much they move. And if you're doing a few different students in this, in this process, you'll start to see that some are taking on the ideas and generalising much more than other students. Some students' personality might affect it. They're a bit timid or they're shy of making mistakes publicly, so thinking all that into account. But it's something, and I've referred to an article down the bottom by Konevsky and Geek. They actually have explained their study and a process of a tool they were using and give the examples of what they did and how they coded the discussion they had with students to decide at what degree the student had high learning potential. But particularly for students who've got cultural linguistic differences from the mainstream class, this can be a fairer way because you're taking into account what they knew at the start before you jump straight to the end. And it can be also useful information feedback into whatever interventions you're doing, and then also useful as just a tracking mechanism along the way. Identifying creativity. Again, it's something that we don't necessarily do explicitly in the curriculum anyway, but essentially there are, depending on who you go with, three main factors. There's flexibility, so the number of students that students come up with, the fluency, so the pace of them solving whatever problem you set and switching between different approaches, and then also the novelty of the original.
No sound.
So I'm going to just click on a link because I wanted to show you some pictures of how that actually can be assessed.
That may cause a bit of an issue.
Oh, not a link?
Yeah, have a go.
Okay.
But I'll probably have to, it'll take us out and in.
Okay.
So.
And then I just do okay. So just let's check if everyone can see it.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, they've actually said I can't cite this paper. It's available on the internet, so I've given everyone the link. But what I wanted to do is take you to show you the problems that they'd set as part of this study here. So let me make it bigger. So what they've done in this part of this study is set a range of problems. I'm hoping everyone can see, that they encouraged students. They said, we want you to come up with as many solutions as you can. And then what I'm going to dig into is this worded problem, the jam problem, which is not a particularly complicated, but you can create these own activities yourself. It's a fun, challenging activity, but then also a really good source of information. So if I go down, I'll show you what one student submitted for the jam problem. And you can see that they actually came up with 9 different solutions. And different ways that the researchers in this case classed as quantitatively different or qualitatively different solutions. So that's actually giving us some really interesting insight into the student and what sort of programming might be useful for them. If I go back, will it? Oh no, I need to go back. There, great. So I've put the link there because I'd encourage you to just have a look at that. In terms of identifying creativity, I think that that's something that's worthwhile investigating more because it's something that we want to encourage in high potential students. And the behavioural rating scale, I'm going to take you out again and then we'll stay on that. I'd like to do a little activity on that or a reflection for a minute. But the observation, so it's not just about the tests and quantitative performance on tests or standardised testing, but also what are you seeing in terms of behaviours? So the reason I'm pulling up this scale by Renzulli, another researcher in the US, is because they've actually tested it quite widely and validated it as a useful scale. So again, it says copyright on it, so I've just created a link for you. But for people who go to page, we're almost there, 18, you can see the list of 10 characteristics that they've provided, and they all seem to make sense and they're consistent with what Krotetsky said. So a student who's actually eager to solve challenge mathematical problems, and they don't get necessarily over time, they get accustomed to and not stressed by not knowing what to do in advance. They're organising data, they're trying to find mathematical patterns, they're enjoying the challenge, they're understanding new concepts more easily or more quickly than other students, displaying a strong number sense, so they can develop a feel for what's happening. And some of these will be more important in primary school or middle school than in high school. Frequently solving mathematics problems abstractly. Have an interest in analysing the structure of a problem and identifying classes of problems. And then when solving a maths problem, they can swap strategies. That's not working, that's taking really long. I can think of a more efficient way of solving it. They're starting to see elegance and beauty in the maths. And also using a variety of representations to explain their concepts, whether it's written, whether it's pictorial or graphic. So what I'd like you to do is just think of 5 students in your class, or at a given time maybe we'll keep it to 2 students, and see how many of these different, students that you think actually are high potential or high achieving, how many of these boxes do they actually tick for you? So I'll give people a moment. I'll take a guide on how long you take by watching the person in the room. If people just maybe want to give me a heads up when you've had an opportunity to think through.
Look, I've certainly got one in my, as I said, as I mentioned before, I've got a grade 5 girl who I think is operating at a really high level, and she's clearly ticking all of those boxes all the time. She can very readily transfer her knowledge, see generalisations, see things spatially.
Yeah. So what we'll find is, if you think about the normal curve or the bell curve, just as there are huge differences from the students from an academic point of view at the kind of the left side of the curve, there are also huge differences between those who are then at the high potential end of it. And so some students who might still be quite different from the rest of the class may not tick all the boxes, and other students will be ticking all of these. And we need to actually understand the student to decide what's actually appropriate for them.
Do we need to get any comments from them?
So does anyone have any comments that they want to make here? If you want to turn your microphone on. Silent. Okay, so we've thought about what characteristics to display. Now I'd like you to think about, with those students that you thought of, do you think they're high potential? Do you think that they show creativity? Are they creative, or are they high achieving? Because I know I've had this conversation with people about how do I tell the difference between high achieving students and high potential students. Now with the students who are just way out and 5 years ahead of the curriculum, you'd probably very comfortably say they're high potential. But once you've got students who are a year or 2 out, is it a question of them working really hard and like the wheels are spinning fast and you can't ask them to spin it any faster than they are? Or are they actually perhaps coasting and high potential and could be stretched? If we're thinking about Vygotsky's zone of approximate, with scaffolding they could be stretched further. And we need to sort of think about those. So I'll give you just a moment to reflect on the students that you chose, whether you actually think they are all high potential and whether some of them are high potential but not gifted, not creative, and whether some of them might just be high achieving but you're not sure if they're high potential. Did anyone have any questions?
Do we have any comments on that? What do people think? Can you identify with having students that have got high potential? Or I suppose most of us would be more easily able to identify the high achieving students because we see their results often, but actually picking whether they're genuinely high potential or gifted is sometimes the next step. So are there any comments from anyone?
I think it kind of comes down to the type of task that you allow them access to too. If the task allows them to explore aspects creatively and demonstrate that ability, then you're going to see evidence or...
So that's the really good point. If we don't give students opportunities to demonstrate their creativity, we may not see it. And likewise, if we don't actually try and challenge students to stretch them, we may not know how high they can go in terms of what their potential really is. So, and I will mention it later on, but Enrich came up with the concept of the low threshold but high ceiling tasks, where you can allow students just to stretch as far as they're willing to take it. And that, when you're combining that with strategies of observing or journaling and those types of things, can really give you a sense of what the student's potential is. Okay, so I'm just going to summarise quickly and then move on to strategies. But what I say, and this is my own terminology, there's nothing academic about it, but in terms of insightful education, what do you want to know? You want to know what knowledge they actually already have. And then you want to understand their reasoning. So what strategies they have, how good are they justifying, how good are they at communicating it? But you also want to understand their interests. So there was a student, he was in high school, where the parents had asked for more to happen. The head of maths decided they would run the Australian Maths Trust Mathematics Challenge for Young Australians. program before school. The only problem is this student happened to be very sporty, and that clashed with playing soccer with all his classmates before coming into school. So the teacher had created this special class once a week for the student, but the student wasn't interested in doing this at that time. So you don't want to feel that your big efforts are actually not being valued. So it's really important to understand what their interests are as well. And then their values, beliefs and attitudes about maths. And that particularly comes into play with girls and gender, in terms of what messages, cultures coming in about girls and maths, what for all students, what values and beliefs the family has about mathematics and how that might play out, and then also understanding what mathematics they're already doing outside school. So if students decide to teach themselves the next 5 years of mathematics out of school, what you might need to be doing is actually filling any gaps, because they're just following their interests potentially rather than following through and trying to cover our curriculum systematically. Okay, so how? Observe, question, listen to the answers, and our goal really is to understand the student and what they need. And obviously the more and more we get out students who are very, very different from their peers, the fewer students that we need to understand to a deeper and deeper level to actually provide for them. And this is, I've just included, I won't talk about it, but this was a survey that I've done with my mixed age mentoring groups, because I actually wanted to understand not just what they wanted to learn, but how they liked to learn, so that I could make sure that we were taking that into account in any group work that we were doing. So that's just something that you can take away and reflect. I won't talk anymore. So getting into strategies. I'm quoting Linda Sheffield a lot because she published a lot 20 years ago, which I think has been quite formative and pivotal in terms of opening up sort of the approaches that we can think about in terms of thinking. And what she said was there was 3 basically dimensions to including an increasing challenge in mathematics education, and she writes specifically about mathematics education for high potential students. So she talked about depth, breadth and pace, and if you want to translate that further out, historically, we've traditionally thought about depth as extension, we've traditionally thought about pace as acceleration, and we've traditionally thought about breadth as enrichment. But in the last sort of 10 years, she's said, no, I want depth to be more about complexity and about allowing students to explore and go deeper, not just about giving them more complex problems. And pace could be acceleration, but it could also be variable pace. So, for instance, if you had a group of students that rather than doing the full 2-week program, they could cover what you want to cover in the curriculum in less lessons, that leaves an extra lesson or 2 a week for more complex problem solving or open-ended tasks. And breadth traditionally would have been enrichment, but now she's focusing very much more on encouraging students to make connections, whether those connections are within maths, within a topic, across topics, or with other fields as well. So I'll dig into each of those more deeply. But depth, and this is a very famous quote, think deeply about simple, oh, and I forgot, I'll have to add the name of the person who wrote it. This is Arnold Roth, who created a whole program in the US, basically aimed at high school students and giving them experiences at university to, over summer programs, to actually engage in really deep thinking about mathematics. And it's quite analogous to what the National Mathematics Summer School offers students to do. It's really based, and he came out here and helped them set it up, but really allowing students to take something very simple and then ask all those questions and pull it all apart and think as much as they can about it. So what might that be? One way you can do it in a really easy way, and I'm going to give you different ways that can be included, is with whatever you're doing in class to give students extending problems. So if they're doing something specific, see whether you can link it to the current task, but encourage them with questions to actually explore it further. The next step would be, thinking about that continuum, encourage them to actually ask their own questions with the current task as the starting point. Now, they might actually need support from the teacher about thinking about the task, or thinking about the thinking. So thinking about the task might be thinking about what happens if I do this? What happens, is this the only answer that I could get? And I can provide a link here to, so she has a list of about 10 questions for thinking on task and 10 thinking about thinking, but really useful to thinking about your thinking about, well, what am I thinking about when I pursue this path, and what happens if I started thinking about it differently? So really trying to get them to expand rather than be limited by a very narrowly defined task. And she provides an open heuristic which basically says you can start anywhere. So if you're given a problem, you don't know how to solve it, you've not seen anything like it before, can you relate it to another problem? And you can start anywhere here on this pentagram. What would you do to investigate it? Once you've investigated it, how would you communicate it to the other students? That in itself can be really important for actually developing your reasoning and making sure that you can support as a student everything you say. Evaluating the solution. Is this solution, is the strategy I use the best strategy? Could I come up with other ones? And then also perhaps creating, as I said, posing their own problems, creating other problems for themselves or for other students. So that's a way that depth can be really practically explored in the classroom without actually having to create a different lesson plan for, you know, one or more students within your class, which is sort of, it's nice in terms of thinking differentiation, but not really practical in terms of the amount of time it takes of people. We're talking about resources for depth. Starting points can be classwork. There's a lot of resources on problem solving and tasks, and also the students' interests. So they might want to do extended investigations related to the topic that you're trying to cover, and that you may have pre-tested and discovered that they already know a lot of it, so that they're actually exploring all the things that you want to make sure are firmly embedded in terms of conceptual understanding, but doing it in an investigative way rather than teacher transmission. And there are a really wide range of books. I've included some at the end for teachers or students. There's the internet, so Enrich, as I mentioned. And then a lot of the maths competitions provide really great problems for students to work on, and you can pull them out by topic. So I know the Australian Maths Trust actually breaks up their problems by the different topics, and they're available as resources that schools can purchase. So as you're teaching a topic, if you need more challenging or more open-ended problems for students, there is a huge, endless almost resource of problems. You don't actually have to always create them yourself. Okay, breadth. First of all, there's the breadth across mathematics, and when we think about what we do in primary schools, predominantly, and I may not have been completely thorough here, arithmetic and Euclidean geometry. And then what happens in secondary is we add a whole lot more layers of things. So when we think about mathematics, it's so huge, there's no reason, much as with English, there's no end of literature that students can read. If we wanted to, with a student, actually go broad rather than accelerate ahead, there is a huge array of areas, and there are some terrific books, which I'll refer to in a moment, that are written for students who've only got up to either year 9 or 10 level mathematics. So if you've got a student in year 5 who's already operating at year 10 level, these are books that they can work through with them by themselves, but also with the support and scaffolding of the teacher. So a lot of resources are already there in terms of breadth across mathematics. There's also lots of enrichment topics. This comes from a book that I've got a photo of at the end, but these are all different ideas that you can just think of and weave in. So there's opportunities for exploration there. And then perhaps deriving what we know about it by posing something very simple as opposed to actually doing it. So I actually did a really fun series of sessions with students on sequences and series. They were grade 6, 7, 8 and 9, where they actually then derived we derived the formulas, so year 11 further mathematics for arithmetic and geometric sequences, and then we actually started looking at figure-it numbers, and different students in that group took it to different levels. So one student actually then worked out the general formula for all figure-it numbers, depending on how many sides it had, and another student took it a little bit further and actually created a program that then listed them. So you could say how many numbers in the sequence you wanted. So there's just that really, really high ceiling. So there's terrific opportunities that you can link back into topics. And across disciplines, there is mathematics used in a huge wide range of areas. So we would hope that high potential students don't actually ask, why is this going to be useful for me in later life? But nevertheless, there are opportunities to point it out. So, whether we're talking about meteorology, whether we're talking about more the business world, market research, insurance and risk assessment, those types of things, looking at what's happening out in practice. For some students, they might prefer more applied mathematics. There's lots and lots of opportunities that don't just have to be sort of pure and theoretical. Okay, so resources for breadth. There's biographies, mathematical stories. The Australian Maths Trust has some terrific resources in their Mathematics Challenge for Young Australians enrichment program. And the books that I mentioned, which you can get digitally, is the MAA, so the Mathematics Association Victoria, Anneli Lex Noon Mathematical Library, and some really interesting topics there that students can, depending on their level, can sort of handle by the time they've got about year 9 or 10 level mathematics. And then across the disciplines, getting guest speakers, at lunchtimes and books. There's looking at the mathematics in different areas. So it's sort of like the world is your oyster there if you want to use breadth as one of your strategies, and it's just about making sure that it actually supports the mathematics learning and doesn't distract from it. So if we're going to talk about biographies in class, we don't want that to take away from the fact that they do need to be learning mathematics as well. But we can learn from the persistence that mathematicians over centuries have put in and passed on to the next group of mathematicians to actually solve problems. They're not all solvable in a 40 or 60-minute class. Pace. So the last topic. Typically we think about that as acceleration. And it's the same as the curriculum but at a faster pace, but it has many forms. And I'm not going to go into depth. I know it's very commonly used by schools, and it's all about relative to age peers. So whether they're doing the same core curriculum but different tasks, or whether they've got an individualised curriculum. And really the things to think about is if you're going to do sort of compacting or that type of thing, if the student's covering everything faster in a lesson, what are they going to do with their spare time? If you're compacting, so you're covering, let's say, 2 weeks worth of lessons in only 1.5 weeks, what are you going to do with the rest of that week or the rest of that term or the rest of that year? And then some students maybe do multiple years in one because we've compressed it, or they might skip years. Typically though, and I just had this conversation at the start, many, particularly at the higher end of potential, these students, you can skip them a year, but within a few months, they're just learning at so much faster a pace than the other students, even in an accelerated class, that you're then starting to think about what you need to do to differentiate for them again. So by itself, acceleration doesn't necessarily solve everything, but it does give students more challenge for a period of time, and they might be happier to stay at the pace with other students. So I'm going to skip this just from a time point of view, but the importance of opportunity really comes...
Have a chat.
Pardon? Yeah.
It is a good one to get some feedback.
Yeah. Do you want me to go back to it?
Yeah, it might just be worth it.
Okay. So
to go around the group there and see what's happening.
So in my research for my PhD, what I found is the schools that participate in my interviews are doing just such a wide range of things. And so they made conscious decisions. They didn't try and do everything that I've listed about what they were going to do that suited the culture of their school and the resources that they had and the teaching interests and experience and skills that they had.
Could we just get some quick feedback from people? So I might just nominate a few, and I'll pick a couple of the schools groups so I could see them. Horsham, is there anything in particular you're currently doing that is working or has some...
What do we think? It's probably just classroom things. We're in a primary school, but we're looking at what we can do more so than what we are doing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Right. Benalla, can I... Again, it's just easy to pick when I've got a school group.
Okay. Well, we're very much looking toward what we can do to support those students that we're identifying as having quite considerable potential. Rich tasks, extended learning opportunities, all that sort of thing. So we're investigating.
Are any of the people here part of a school that's got a select entry program, like a SILT program? No? Okay, just wanted to...
So I actually had, 2 interesting snippets from 2 select entry schools that I've spoken to over the years. One's part of my study. And so in the select entry school, they do years 7 and 8 mathematics in 1 year, and the students cope with that just fine. What was interesting in a different, that was in the SEAL program, in a different selective entry school that I spoke to, they actually felt that while they would welcomed all the students as being high potential, the students aren't necessarily selected because they had high potential in mathematics. So, so they might have come in with being, more weighted heavily to their sort of humanities and languages, and that's what got them into the school. But even those who were performing at a high level on whatever assessment they did to enter the school at the mathematics, some of them were being very heavily tutored outside school. So once they came into the school couldn't stretch them any further because they, as I said, they were already running as fast as they could. So they're the sorts of things in terms of identification, getting to understand what's actually happening with the student. It really needs to guide what you're actually, it either expands what you can do or limits what you can do. Keep going. Yeah. Okay, so one thing that Aziskan pointed out, and that's why I've come back to that hierarchy of mathematical talent, is that the mathematical performance is heavily dependent on the culture in which one resides. So your family, and the school, your peers as a student, and also the opportunities that are provided. And what he basically claimed was that in a school without a maths team or maths contest, a maths club, or things that go above and beyond the curriculum, that a student will never actually get beyond, or it's actually really hard for them to get to level 3, and they may never get beyond it. So I've worked with students just, you know, chatted with their parents who were in schools that didn't really offer anything except the core curriculum. And then I was a maths mentor at a school which offered a whole wide range of different opportunities for enrichment for students, and not just enrichment but extension and deep thinking. And I can see the impact that it had, for instance, and I can measure that quantitatively, on their competition performance relative to what's normal across, you know, the averages across Australia for, let's say, the Australian maths competition and those sorts of things. So if the opportunities aren't provided to students, they may have this kind of latent potential, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to develop into talent. So let's think about implementation, and I sort of broke this up into 3 categories in terms of my research. What's happening in class, which is like, it sounds like that's what a lot of people think about, and that is great because the reality is that's where students are engaged with most of the mathematics learning. And then co-curricular opportunities that schools could consider providing, and each of these I'm making aware of, and some of them I'm giving examples from schools that have participated in my study, so I'll go into that a bit more. And I'm not actually going to talk anymore about out of school, but people feel free to contact me by email if you want, just because that's not really the focus of today's presentation. We're really looking at what we can do within the school. So in class, the challenge is, and this is just one of my little favourite cartoons, is, and I know in primary school that happens a bit more, but on the other hand, with a primary school teacher, you've got your generals teacher, they're getting to know the students really, really well, and they can have students operating on slightly different programs. But when you see pull-out classes, what I've heard from some parents is their child loves this once a week pull-out class, and then they go back to regular maths class, and they're just miserable. So bearing in mind that if a student thinks qualitatively differently, you know, at different speed and different depth and those types of things, they're like that all the time. And so having the joys of when they're feeling challenged and engaged and then going back to not having that can be incredibly frustrating for them. And it's actually interesting. I've heard it from students, but the parents remember it even better, which is why the parent nomination can be quite interesting. So different students have different needs, and I'm just going to point out what's in orange. The rest is kind of quotes from Linda Sheffield. But she said the greater the difference in mathematical promise relative to peers, in other words, the further they are out kind of to the right of a normal curve, the more the students will need individualised services. And so you actually do need to know where they kind of fit relative to peers to be able to sort of really fully assess whether what you're currently doing is actually meeting their needs. So in class, typically the different approaches that might be used, personalisation's becoming a bit more in conversation now, but where the learner drives its learning. What's more typical is differentiation, where the teacher provides instructions to groups of learners and make sure that the different groups, in terms of their kind of group together, are doing things that are appropriate for them. And then individualisation, where the teacher provides instruction to an individual learner. So they might, even though they're in a regular, mixed group class, they might be doing a completely different program. And I've seen certainly differentiation, individualisation working for some students and not for others. So differentiation can work as long as the students, what's being offered matches what their needs are. Individualisation, if the student's just left to themselves and isn't actually being supported in their learning, whether it's an outside mentor or also through the classroom teacher, can get very lonely for a student, and it's only really driven students who are actually going to make the most of that. Some of them will just end up sort of mucking around and actually not making much progress in learning. So there's a lot of personality coming into play as to what strategies are appropriate. And this model, this book down here describes it in detail, but it's a model for individualised learning, which is essentially you pre-test, and that's a strategy I would recommend no matter what other strategies put in place. Just always pre-test before a topic and find out what the students already know, because if they actually already know and they're getting 80 to 100% on the end of topic test, then really, unless there are gaps, they're not making effective use of time while you teach that topic. So the idea here is that you diagnose what they're at, and then they work out what the gaps are, fill those gaps, do a post-test, and if they've achieved what you've considered mastery, then you go through that cycle of then test them at the next level, identify the gaps. And for students who have the motivation and the capacity to teach themselves, they can jump ahead many, many years, but they can go along the way gathering a lot of gaps in terms of content. So this approach is really about working where they're at, filling the gaps, and then moving them forward. So it's very much an individualised acceleration program. And this comes out of the study of mathematically precocious youth, which has been operating for 40 years in the US. And there are hundreds of papers, tens or it might be hundreds of books now. There's a lot of research on this and how it works and what can be done. So there's certainly opportunity to read more about this. In terms of electives, just some examples from schools that were part of my study. So one school had a coding algorithmic thinking elective in Year 8, and then they offered discrete mathematics in Year 9. Another school had proof as a Year 9 mathematics. And then another school again, these were both actually selective entry schools. One had modelling big problems, so it was really focusing on applied mathematics in the real world. And the other school had more of a pure mathematics investigations, driven more by the teacher as opposed to the student. So I've just given these examples of electives you can think of. If your school allows you the ability in high school to offer mathematics as an elective, along with all the other electives that are available, then this provides students the opportunity to opt in if they want more mathematics. And this can also be driven by teacher interests, what teachers want to teach. There's no set thing. But these are just some examples of what's currently being done in Victoria. And clubs. Before school, lunchtime, after school, these are a range again that different schools mentioned to me. So a puzzles club, a problem solving club. In this case, they were doing the mathematics challenge for young Australians. And in this selective, it was a SEAL school. The head of maths actually mentioned to me this was really good for the girls because they did it as a cooperative activity rather than competitive. And so he found a lot more girls were coming to this club than the training for competitions club. Then coding, robotics, solar cars, starting to come a bit peripheral, but still using a lot of reasoning. One of the schools talked about the students being encouraged to initiate, to come and say, I'd really be interested in a club around this, and then it would be built, and perhaps bringing in outside experts, and also driven by their interests. And then mentoring, whether that's a group mentoring situation, but smaller groups where you could focus on any other topics. I'll finish off. I'm not going to talk about this, but it's not a complete list, but there are many, many competitions, both individual and team, both problem solving and informatics that you can use with your students. Some of them are a bit more expensive. The Australian Maths competition and the University of Melbourne School Mathematics competition are quite cheap for schools. It creates all sorts of logistics exercises for schools in terms of supporting students to do them. But they're fabulous opportunities for students to kind of just come out and test themselves and think with really challenging problems. They're also fabulous, and a lot of them are available on the internet, so all the University of Melbourne School Mathematics competition, past competitions are available, and work solutions. Really great resources so that you can actually challenge students and find things related to the topic.
Can I jump in there? Yeah. Give it a promotion as well.
I'm about to.
So, and for those of you, most of you may obviously be aware of some of the MAV activities, but so yeah, the games days are there as it has been listed, and they are great. And the team aspect of that with the team of 4 students, I don't think there's too much problem in those being this year. I think they're all filled to capacity. But if your school hasn't been involved, I'd really encourage you as a starting point, especially because it's a team aspect. And if you're in a regional area and you would like to start one up, then please email me and we'll look at doing that. The other thing I did want to, because I think some of Simone's presentation reminded you of it, and we're talking a little bit more about that today. We've just finished the Maths Talent Quest, and for some of those high-end kids, especially when you want to give them something more open-ended that they could just explore, that is great. And particularly at the moment, I find our numbers at the secondary, we don't get many students participating in that at the secondary level. And yet that does give them that opportunity to take an open-ended task. And I liked Simone's pentagram because I think I might pinch
I'm actually going to
That's a great starting point for doing your Maths Talent Quest.
I'll add the
challenge.
link to that. There's a chapter out of her book that actually goes, and it's a handout you can give to students. And so that's what I used to do, is I'd give it to the beginning of the year and say, here's the pentagram, and here's a whole lot of questions related to each of those steps. That would get them along the point of we're giving them the questions and them starting to ask their own questions.
And the third one, I might just give a plug just in case, because I know we've got a couple of regional people. For the last 2 years now, through Department of Ed funding, I've actually been running a maths camp for high potential regional students, Year 10 students, and that's been really positive for those kids because they come down to Melbourne, they spend a week and they explore an area of interest and they get a real life maths problem to do from one of the industries. So Ford will give them an engineering one. We've got the RBA giving them a commerce problem, the Space Science Centre. So they get to visit all those. It is application based and it is totally paid. There's no cost at all for the students for the week there. But yeah, that is for particularly for regional students.
So these are actually, and I'm going to add those to the list before you make this available. All these competitions here are basically open. A student doesn't need to qualify for them. There are then a whole beyond this a range of invitational opportunities. So if a student does particularly well in the Australian Maths competition and the Australian Intermediate Maths Olympiad, they could then get into the Olympiad pathway with the Australian Maths Trust. There's also, for students who are in Year 11, the opportunity to actually apply with school support in Victoria, and it's through the MAV, or is it anyway for the National Mathematics Summer School?
Yes.
So when you're talking about the National Mathematics Summer School, it's very much about exploration and deep thinking. They're not actually told the solutions to problems, but they can get feedback on, have you thought of this, have you thought of that? So it's a very different experience for mathematics, and it's a really great social experience for students as well. I just had a fabulous day observing that, spending a day up there observing how it worked, and it's quite inspirational. Okay, so again, do we want to take the time or skip?
It's up to you.
It's up to everyone. What I wanted you to think here is really, I've listed a whole range of different things that you might consider, so maybe take a moment just to jot down on a piece of paper or amongst yourselves if you're a group, what other things might be useful that you're not currently doing at the moment? Both in class and both co-curricular. So mathematics days, for instance, it could be a school mathematics day, or it could be a mathematics day through MAV or another organisation, or like different groups, schools in a regional area might get together and create an opportunity. And some people have like a parent and child maths night. Excursions, electives, clubs, competitions, and then obviously what's happening in class. Does anyone want to ask any questions? Okay, well, we're nearing the end. I have avoided mentioning grouping the whole way through. I will just acknowledge that it is, according to the research from 2010, so we're already almost a decade ago, by Professor Helen Forgas, it is widely used in Victoria. So they said, is there some form of streaming? 80% said yes. Bear in mind it was a very small sample, and 9% said no. And then there was differences of opinion about whether the teachers who were sampled actually agreed with the policy. And the other thing that became clear was it's more and more heavily used as students progress towards the end of secondary school. And clearly, once you're getting to year 11 and 12, it's self-selection into different groups based on the subjects that you choose, whether it's general maths, further maths, maths methods, or specialist maths. What I will say, because I think the decision really depends on the school's culture, its values, is there are different forms of grouping, and I think people need to be clear, particularly when we're talking about years 7 to 10 or in primary school for different programs, what is it in? So a standard classroom is actually by age. But if you're doing something different, is it going to be by ability? Is it going to be by achievement? Is it going to be by interest? Or is it going to be we offer a program and then students self-select in? And once that happens, there are different groups of students, and it may be that it's only for mathematics, or it might be for other subjects as well because of timetabling. And the research is mixed on the benefits of grouping. Generally, it's viewed that it's detrimental for weak and average students, although when you actually pull apart the research, I think some of that is about the way it's implemented. And however, generally, and there are some disagreements, that it is beneficial for high potential students. One, because you can then go at a faster pace because you've got a narrow range of students. You can provide more challenge. That sort of environment might encourage more motivation. So rather than just surfing, they're actually really starting to get in. And there are social benefits, particularly for students who are really, really different from other students in terms of their interest or capacity in mathematics, to actually connect with other students who just love mathematics as well. So there are pros and cons, and I think it's really a school decision and a teacher decision. I wasn't going to push that other way. I just wanted to acknowledge that it is a strategy that schools use as part of providing for high potential students. So, finishing up, these are sort of some of the key resources for educators, and I have a whole list, but there were too many, so in the end I didn't choose them, of actual books that have been created and resources that have been created to help teachers for recent students. So, this was the Krotetsky book that I mentioned. This is an old book, Develop Mathematical Problems for Students, but it actually has chapters from all around the world and all different ways, so there's some really lovely case studies if you want to borrow it from a library and just get ideas, whether it's after-school programs, in-school programs, in the class. Developing math talent, if you have a student who is truly exceptional and they're going to need an individualised program, it goes into a lot of detail about actually how to implement that. And then thinking about creativity in mathematics, these are two very good books that collect a lot of research in the area. These are very much research-driven books. Developing Mathematically Promising Students is predominantly written by either researchers or teachers. So that's very interesting. And this last book actually poses the question, does high achieving in mathematics equal gifted and or creative in mathematics? So that's also, as we talked about right at the beginning with identification, an interesting conundrum. And he goes through, the author, or Jules Sherman goes through thinking about and putting a framework about what the differences and similarities might be. So some other resources I'd just like to let you know. Obviously, I should have put Mathematical Association of Victoria at the top because there are some fantastic resources here. I'll add that before we release this. But the Victorian Association of Gifted and Talented Children is there to support schools and teachers. We also support parents. And we have, beyond our website and Facebook, we also have Twitter and all of those other social media. So if it's something that you want to follow, that's there. For people who are living in regional areas, supported by the Department of Education, we run in various towns, sort of satellite areas, rural seminars. This year we did about identification and about provision. And there's also my little Facebook page where whenever I come across something interesting, I just put it up as a post. So, you know, when Australia wins maths awards or there's competitions and just remind us of different competitions, I put it up there. So people are welcome to follow. And on that note, I'd really like to welcome questions, and I can dig deeper into any of those slides. I just wanted to make sure that we covered that helicopter view very quickly in terms of the really huge range of strategies, and there are a huge range of resources to support them so that you don't need to create everything from scratch yourself. Ooh, home. So.
Okay, over to you people. Are there any questions, comments, feedback? So if you've got a question, can you please just unmute your mic and go? Never know.
Did you have a question to get us started?
I suppose one of the constraints is having the time to source all the resources, the time to offer that sort of mentorship one-on-one, and that's always really difficult in a small school where obviously you know funding is limited. Teachers are already teaching to their full allotments. I don't know. I suppose I'm just sort of making that comment as such. That it is sometimes a tough ask to.
So when I started my PhD, my main thing was I want to make this easy. I want to understand how to make it easy for teachers and schools to do. Not that you can. So what I've identified here is a range of different things that the school's doing and a range of different things you could do, but I would never suggest sitting down and going tick, tick, tick and trying to do all of them at once. You might say within 5 years we want to be doing this range of things, but only adding in one thing each year, because realistically we all have the right to sleep and to have a break from teaching and have a break for students. So I didn't talk about what can happen outside school, but there are resources that sometimes it's just not feasible for a school to offer some of these things, but you can guide parents and link them up. So one of the students I worked with is linked up with an academic at University of Melbourne. He's quite exceptional, and they don't meet that often. I think it's once a month. He's also linked up with a student who was a few years above him and is now at university, or that happened for the first few years until this student is now on rounds.
Okay, Helen, good luck to you.
Question? Sorry. We've got someone with a question over there. No? Sorry, we just heard someone come on, so I just wondered if there's a question.
So in terms of making links to university mentors and such. Are those links readily available? Like are those avenues easy to pursue?
So with what will typically happen is if you have a connection with where you studied and you have a connection with people in the maths department, that's a really good place to start. Probably the academics themselves, it depends. Each university is structured a bit differently. So sometimes maths education is in the Department of Mathematics and the Faculty of Science, and sometimes maths education is in the Faculty of Education. So working out what those links are and not limiting yourself. The mathematicians who are in the Department of Mathematics are typically going to only want to work with the really, really top. But there may be some who have a very big interest in mathematics education as well. And obviously, if you're talking about people who are in the Faculty of Education and Mathematics, they also have links among themselves to other people. So sometimes it might not be linking up with a mathematician in university, but linking up to someone in industry. So looking at the community around you, any retired engineers, any retired oceanographers, anyone that had, in that list of careers that I had a degree of mathematics in them. So I know... I was speaking with someone who lives overseas in America, and he's a mentor, and he sat down with the student he mentored, and he was in physics. And they just identified a topic they both wanted to learn. Neither of them knew it, and they learnt it together. So there was a process of modelling. How do I start to learn something I don't know yet with a 10-year-old and a 70-year-old?
Fantastic.
So I think it's really important not to burn yourselves out in the process of thinking about what we can do with the students, and by speaking with them and possibly their parents to understand what is really important to them, you can just focus on what's important to them as opposed to trying to do too many things.
Okay, I know we've gone a little bit over time, so a couple of things. Firstly, a big thank you to Simone. I think she's covered an awful lot of ground in that span of time. And lots of information there, lots of interesting resources. I also want to say, Simone, we'll follow up with some of those books that Simone has recommended and see if we can actually get them here at MAV for sale, hopefully by conference as well. That'd be good to have some of those as resources. Yep, and as promised, both Simone's PowerPoint and the recording of this, although I'm not sure if I think I only asked them to record the hour, so we'll see how we go with that, will be made available to everyone. And Simone, are you happy for your email?
Yeah, that's fine.
And we'll also put Simone's email on the first slide of her PowerPoint as well, so if you have any direct questions, then feel free to email if that's something you may wish to do. So thank you all for your participation. Hopefully we're getting a little bit better at delivering by this medium as we go. And thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Simone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.